I welcome Lauren Coles, who's going to present the program. This was one of the great ideas that she's put together. Lauren Coles from Co-Architects. Lauren, welcome.
Thank you, Will, and thanks everybody for joining me tonight. Yes, I am Lauren Coles. I'm a project manager and architect at Co-Architects, a member of the AIA Practice Committee, and I will be moderating the discussion, co-moderating the discussion this evening with Jessica Orlando. So as a repeat to what Will was saying, please make sure that you remain muted throughout the discussion. If you don't mute yourself, we will mute you for you, but we don't want to have to do that. So please keep yourself muted. If you have any questions though that come up, please make sure to put them in the chat box, and Jessica will select and read those to the panelists at the end of the panel. And finally, please note that this session is being recorded. So now on to the fun stuff. I think we know that we'll be discussing the future of remote work with our panelists this evening. Almost a year ago now, most architectural practices were mandated to begin work remotely. You know, at that time, many firms implemented IT strategies as well as new health safety protocols at unprecedented speeds. And since then, it's been a pretty challenging year, but offices are now fine-tuning and those practices and protocols. So hopefully now, with the pandemic's end, hopefully in sight, architecture firms now kind of have to look at how we reintegrate back into the office while considering the benefits and challenges of working remotely. So with that, the AIA Practice Committee assembled this group of experts that will manage architectural practices of different sizes and with different architectural specialties to discuss this topic. And so now I would like to introduce to you the panelists. First up, we have Scott Kelsey, and Scott Kelsey is Managing Principal at Co-Architects. Hi, Scott. Second, we have Marissa Kurtzman, who is a partner at Frederick Fisher and Partners. Hi, Marissa.
Hi, it's Marissa, actually.
Marissa. And hi, Aviva. Next, we have Aviva Rappaport, and she is Principal and Director of Architecture HRK.
Thank you. Thank you for having us here.
And last but not least, we have Christina Singeiser, who is Managing Principal at HMC Architects.
Good evening, everyone.
Okay, well, with the introductions, let's see here, over, I think we can jump into the first question for Marissa. And I hopefully, Marissa, you can start this panel off. And the question is, what have been your biggest challenges in managing remote work with staff and with clients this past year?
Well, I think I'm going to start with clients. I think that we had been ramping up our agility with these kinds of virtual interfaces prior to the pandemic. You know, we work all over the country, so we were not unfamiliar with having Zoom meetings and conference calls and that sort of thing. But certainly the collaborative element of being an architect is hugely important to our process. And so when COVID hit, that aspect of working with our clients just became all that much more challenging. Personally, I'm very involved with the front end of our architectural practice. I spearhead our visioning, programming, and planning efforts. And that in particular is so face-to-face. There's so much about not only building a client relationship at that early stage of the process, but also we get together for day-long workshops where we're kind of doing interactive exercises and drawing on boards and trying to share all that information. And just after the pandemic, we started a new project with a commercial client that we had to really pivot on that. It was a 40-person visioning session. That's a pretty big one for even just in person. And then suddenly we had to figure out how to do it virtually. And it was a challenge, but fortunately we were able to think quickly on our feet, and that was really ultimately a successful template for moving forward. I think a couple of the other issues as far as the related to our client and staff is this interface. Obviously, I think all of us, without these virtual video conference softwares, we would not have been able to do what we do this past year. And so on some level, we're really lucky, but the scale of these things is definitely an interesting challenge. You know, it's very different to have a 4-person meeting versus the 81 people who are on this call. And especially if you're trying to share information or read body language, it just becomes much more complicated. And then that's sort of that whole idea of communication, I think, is really the crux of how the challenge has affected just not only our clients, but also with our staff. I mean, certainly communication is always really a critical point of practice, and with our staff, not, with teams getting together, there's not that sort of side-by-side, hey, can I talk to you about the project component? You have to really make an effort. And then of course, during office-wide communication, that also needed to be something that was really important. We started implementing a weekly Monday morning half-hour session of just to check in, which has helped, but it's still, and I think it's been an incredibly emotionally challenging year for everyone, not just because of COVID, because of so many things that happened last year, huge major world events. And we've all been experiencing them in isolation, and we come to our work environments and we have friends there, and we like to talk to people about those things and just checking in with our staff, making sure that people are okay. It just can't be done enough. So I would say those are the biggest changes.
I don't know if that dovetails into work that you do, Aviva, and how
Sure.
clients.
Sure. So I can speak a little bit to that. So, I think and some of, I think what we're talking about is not unique to architecture, but then I think some of it is. So I think the part that's maybe not that unique is, I think, what this platform, this remote platform, has actually brought to our relationships, which is this sort of view into everyone's world. The dog in the screen, the noise in the background, in my case, sometimes the strange Wi-Fi connection, looking like I'm someone who's dubbed in a foreign language. But I think that there's this other aspect of connection which is really quite wonderful, which is this glimpse and a sort of sharing of everyone and how sort of human we all are and our circumstances are. And I think there is an aspect to that develops a different kind of client relationship, which I think is quite special. So that's actually been, as hard as it's been not being able to meet with people in person. I do think that there is sort of this real personal touch to the connection that I think is effective in many ways. I think specifically to the profession, some of the things that are challenging are things like, just the scale of the presentations. How much can you see on a screen versus when you're inside of a room, with a wall full of material, and you can walk with the client, from one place to another in that room. And, that kind of an aspect of scale of how we're presenting, because of course, ultimately, we're usually presenting buildings. So it's nice to look at large images and look at them side by side, which we can't always do in the same way, I think, on a screen. And I think another thing sort of unique to our profession is the materiality, right? The concrete materiality of what we do. And so sometimes, it's like, how do we share the product materials? Do we send them a sample board and then walk them through it? So there are these funny logistical things that we stumble through sometimes. But, I think it's pretty remarkable, really remarkable how much we have been able to create those connections with clients. And I think, to Marisa's point, it's been just such a challenging year for so many people, including our clients, right? And so there's a shared experience. There's a new shared experience that we have together with them and, you know, whether they be institutional clients or corporate clients, obviously this period of time is so impactful, and it's a time of evaluation. It's a time of rethinking, and from that, I think, can be born some wonderfully creative ideas.
And I was going to add on the staff side, I think another challenge that we maybe didn't anticipate is really working on the work-life balance that our staff has. Work is always there when you're at home. It's always in front of you. And staff, you know, we're all overachievers and had a hard time with work-life balance before this, but having it just that more accessible to you has really created some obstacles that we didn't anticipate, I don't think. People working all hours of the night and just churning and not being able to walk away from, you know, you used to go home to walk away from your work, and now your work is in your home. So I think that's one that we're still going to be struggling with as we move forward with the remote working.
I guess what I would just add to it is that when we all went out over a very short span of time, the challenges that we assumed that we would have turned out to not be challenges at all. So challenges associated with infrastructure or technology or platforms to collaborate on, be it Slack or Miro, or texting or you know, emailing, that in fact, all of that held up. And I suspect that that is probably more uniformly true amongst a lot of professionals, that we all figured out how to do it, probably in a way that we actually never anticipated that we could. So for me, it was quite surprising how everything sort of turned upside down, because the things that I was most worried about turned out to be non-issues at all, largely, not entirely, but largely. I think our biggest challenges was really the stress of being in isolation, the fact that everyone's home office is not the same. Everyone's way of working is not the same. Their access to technology is not the same. Their bandwidth's not the same. So we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to level that access to the extent that we could. Lots of stress associated with overtime, very, very long hours. Our overtime has gone up by 50% in 2020 over the year before. And I think part of that is because having a day full of meetings still requires that you have an evening full of work. And the fact that you can't engage and work at the same time, another meaningful work, has, I think, been a big challenge. And then I think our biggest challenge has been the design process and the kind of fluidity of a team being together, sharing ideas, challenging each other, being able to sort of work in a collaborative way is just, one is able to do it remotely, but I think it's very challenging. And I think that that remains a real central question for our practice.
Aviva, did you have something to add on?
Yeah, it's sort of in relation to what both Christina and Scott were speaking about, which I think is really important to articulate around the issues of, you know, equity that have been widely discussed in the media around this particular period of time. And I think sometimes we sort of overlook that in our practice, and we think, well, you know, everyone has a connection, everyone has a computer set up, like, oh, it's, you know, but really we do see a challenge, and we do see, you know, everyone has a different situation at home, everyone has a different kind of workspace at home, a different physical workspace, a different family situation, and, you know, ultimately, of course, we want everyone to have that equal opportunity to be able to work in the best way possible for them, right? And so while in some cases, I think it's really benefited some people who really enjoy working remotely, who are effective at working remotely, who have fantastic connections, and who may have otherwise had a very long commute to the office. In other ways, it's been incredibly tough for others who really benefited from being in the office. So, you know, it will be really interesting in the future to start to think about these things as we return to the office. You know, what is an equitable access to the work environment, right? What does that mean? Does that mean, again, that everyone has the same space in the office? Does it mean provision for more remote working? And how does that look like?
That's a valid challenge. And I think it almost leans into our second question of the evening, which is taking from those concerns. In your opinion, how do you think collaboration will be different post-pandemic? In addition, how do you see or not see working from home like aligning with your practice values? Christina, did you want to start us off on this one?
Sure. We've been talking about what it looks like to go back in the office. And while no one really wants to make any decisions at the moment, it's looking like the office is going to become the place where collaboration can happen. And when we want to get a team together to do a charrette or something, we're going to do it in the office and try to avail ourselves of that opportunity, some of the time, instead of trying to continue to collaborate remotely. As Scott talked about, the issues around designing remotely is still difficult, and I don't think we've quite figured it out yet. So using the office space and the time in the office as a focused time for collaboration. And then that allows, when you're at home, that you can have that more private, focused time on your work, so that maybe we can get out of our cycle that I think a lot of people are in right now of so many meetings, because this remote environment has just led to that many more meetings, because everything is a meeting now. You can't just have that conversation as you're walking by that we would have in the office. So I think that it's going to kind of end up being a little bit more split.
Scott, did you want to elaborate?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I could sort of pick up on what Christina's saying and talk a little bit about how we imagine it might affect our relationship with owners and builders, which is to say, I do think that we've come to realize that we can work in a more effective hybridized way with our clients. And our clients actually, most of our clients are institutional clients. There's lots of user engagement. And I think what we've realized is that they like working that way as much as we do, because they can multitask and they can come in and out of discussions, which is not to say that it's a replacement for in-person engagement, but we can imagine a future where there's some percentage of in-person engagement as well as virtual engagement. That has benefit because we all spend a lot less time in planes because we work around the country and we do some international work, which would be a benefit. We save all of that time, we lower our carbon footprint, and we could spend more time with our family and our friends and be in the office or be doing other things. So I think there's some real power in how we can all work with owners and builders and collaborators and consultants. I think we're probably a little bit less unclear what the future of our studio is and how do we define that, and how are we going to work together, because we continue to believe that being together and having exchange and younger people learning from the team in the physical setting is really, really important. And so we're still debating really what that model looks like for us as a practice culture.
Yeah, I would say, just to add to what Scott mentioned, there are some aspects of collaboration that I think have been much more successful. Obviously, not having to get on a plane is a really nice component of this if you don't want to spend the extra time. But certainly mentorship, I would say, has really suffered, especially for our newer to architecture staff. And we're aware of that. And there's sort of no substitute for the casual drive-by learning experience that you get when you're in an office. That isn't to say that we haven't seen the benefits of this component. I think there is that time for collaboration, and there is that time also for the heads down work that we all want to do. And I think, for those of us who've worked in an open office environment, we have been successful or not successful in working that way to varying degrees. I also wanted to touch again on what Aviva mentioned earlier is the notion of equity. I think one thing that makes Zoom collaboration of this nature particularly challenging is that, for example, we're in this meeting right now with 90 people. Everyone's on mute, except for the people who are talking. And if you want to say something, there's this kind of, you have to be very careful and tentative about not talking over people. You get to this place, and I think this is a situation where everybody getting a voice at the table becomes just that much more challenging in this kind of environment. So that being said, I do think we appreciate the benefit of it, and certainly in our office, we very much prioritize work-life balance, and on some level, remote work has helped with that, and on some level, it hasn't. So figuring out how that looks like in the future will be certainly interesting. When we started doing a back to work plan, probably like the second week that we were home, thinking like, oh yeah, it'll be a month. And certainly it's been longer than that. But I think we've learned some interesting lessons. We've also worked with a number of our clients to kind of help them visualize their back to work scenarios. We did a fairly extensive study with Otis College to figure out, how do you do art school not in person? That's a real challenge. And some of the lessons we learned there about the hybridization have been informative for ourselves. It's on some level democratizing to be able to have access to huge amounts of information, to perhaps lower our carbon footprint by not getting on a plane. But at the same time, you're right, not everyone's home environment or bandwidth is the same. And we've actually never closed our office. We've always had a handful of about half a dozen people working in there. And that was by choice. That was, I think, our first lesson learned, is after we sort of took the temperature of our staff, that any work from home policy at this time had to be voluntary. And some people wanted to, and some people didn't. And we had to address that for both groups.
I also think it's so interesting that we're all talking about back to work, and I feel like I've never worked harder, so I can't imagine going back, because it already seems like there's plenty, and I think everyone sort of feels the same way. So it's really interesting. I think we keep and I say we in the larger, not just this conversation, but just much broader, right? Back to school, back to work, so it's really kind of an interesting mindset that everyone seems to have, that things are going to go backwards. So I love to kind of think about how we're going to go forwards, and how we're going to be more versatile now. And I think Scott's talked about this, and Maurice has talked about this, and Christina's talked about it. It's like, I think as a profession now, we have, we've actually been able to grasp these methods and ways of communicating that we didn't quite have a full handle on before. We never thought we could do this before. So I like to think about it going forward, and kind of reset what that might mean. And then how do we bring those personal aspects that we have through the remote platforms, how do we bring those into the office in ways that we didn't before? Because people are going to probably miss that aspect of who we are, right? And it doesn't mean like carrying our furniture with us from home into the office, but what does it mean? So I think that's an interesting exploration to kind of look at as well.
I was going to say, I think it's also really led to this level of flexibility that we never thought we had before. And it allows people to, recognize where they do their best work. Because some people went, working from home has been like, awesome. I can get my work done. It really makes sense for me. And some people are really craving the buzz that happens in an office. And so I think this has shown us that we can be flexible, and we can let people decide where their best work is done, and really capitalize on that. Whereas before we thought, no, you had to be in the office in order to be effective, but that's not really the case anymore.
I think the question, Christina, I think it's a really good observation. And I think that we have seen the same thing. Just a sort of an aside, but I think important, is that when we all work 100% virtually, we're all working off the same platform. I would make an argument, as someone who largely draws by hand through the design process, it's been very humbling to work on this platform. whereas a younger person is very digitally trained and they're very facile. And I find it very frustrating because I in a generation of architects can't work quite as quickly that way. And so it actually has been very leveling for us as practitioners. And so there's a learning experience in there, I think, for us to think about. I mean, I think the question is, you're right, some people have really excelled and have flourished in this environment. Other people have really been isolated, frustrated, under a lot of stress, especially young parents. Parents have been crushed in this, but hopefully that will resolve itself over time. But the question is, when we move to a hybridized model, then what becomes the dominant form of communication? If 3 out of 5 people on a team are in the office and 2 are remote, does that mean we all work virtually to engage the other 2? Do the other 2 have to find a way to engage with the 3 in a non-virtual way? I mean, what does that look like? And we don't know the answer to that, but it does require a reimagining of what our collaboration model is in that environment. And as I say, we don't know yet what that looks like. We put a high value in being together for a variety of reasons, but we're still trying to explore the implications.
Okay. Well, given our hypotheses of how potentially we could collaborate in the future, what processes are you actually going through currently that look for new ways of working? Are you trying to implement any of these ideas right now? I don't know if Scott, if you want to take this one.
So I think we have a working group. I mean, it's been as you know, Lauren, it's been a constant source of discussion in the office. A variety of people have really been trying to look at it. So we see it as both. We see it as both an organic process and one where we're trying to solicit kind of different perspectives. I think we very strongly believe that we need to be talking to our consultants and asking them what they want and what they see having value, because ultimately we serve our clients in the process of design. And so we have to make sure that while we want an opportune way of working and reimagining our work process, it ultimately has to connect with our clients. Our clients are really central to what we do. So we have a sort of a group of people exploring different avenues, I guess, for lack of better words. We want it to be broad-based. I think we're a practice culture that believes very strongly in design, one of sort of team-based exploration and collaboration. And we want to we put an emphasis on being together to be able to have those explorations and those debates. And so what we're trying to understand is, how do we allow that to evolve in what will be obviously a future state? We recognize that the more advanced and specialized someone is, the more that they can probably work remotely, as opposed to someone who's more of a generalist, perhaps someone who is younger, because we do believe that the power of our teams are that the young people listen to the discussions and they learn from each other. They learn from the more senior people. And so we don't want to curtail that, because we feel we have a responsibility for education within the practice. So maybe those are some glimpses, Lauren, as you know, into what we're trying to do. We don't know what the answers are. I'll be very clear. We don't know what we don't know at this point in time. So it's very much a work in process.
Christina, is your office also looking at new ways of working?
Yeah, so we're in much in the same boat, and kind of a wait and see as to what happens next. Everything seems to be changing. When we, like Maritza said, when we had a plan, a couple months afterwards, and then that got thrown out of the water, and then the next plan. So I think we're still in a wait and see kind of mode. And I would agree with everything Scott said. The big concern is those chance conversations that you overhear, allowing that face-to-face collaboration where you can see, body language, or you can draw someone out and try to get good ideas out of everyone, which they may not be willing to speak up on a platform like this, where they have to raise their hand formally and the other things that we've been talking about. So I think that, those are all things that we're all still looking at, how we do that and what makes the most sense for coming back to the office.
I think something interesting also to think about is, we sometimes think that when we go, when the office is open again, that those who are working remotely will be working in the same capacity that we are now. And yet, that may not be the case. It's really interesting. If you look at the results of, certain academic retention in the educational setting, for example, some cases you have more people achieving degrees now. Why is that? Why are they achieving more? And this is not always the case, of course, but they're achieving more sometimes because they have zero distractions, because there is nothing else to do but sit at your computer these days, right? And so, so another thing to think about is also how will the remote work change when there are other things happening around us, when there are events that we can go to, when there are places that we can drive to. So so that's, that I think that's part of the discussion, and in a sense part of the unknown, as Scott mentioned, and as Christina mentioned, just a lot of unknowns. But wherever there are a lot of unknowns, there's always just incredible opportunities to rethink what we do, which is a great thing.
Absolutely. I think that, I was looking at the chat as you were talking, and it was raised the issue of, I think, perhaps the group that has suffered the most during this pandemic is the parents of young children. I think it has just been incredibly detrimental for them, for the children. And as much as I think we want to sort of figure out how to embrace these new ways of working, we have to make sure it works for everybody. So how you find that solution, I think it's going to come honestly from a very open conversation with our staff. When we first went into remote work, we did a fair amount of kind of group conversations and polling to kind of develop our policies based on staff needs and desires. And I think it's one thing to sort of just come up with a policy and impose it, but I think based on the type of work environment that we like to cultivate in our office, and we're small enough that we really want people to have a voice in this, because we want to keep people happy, and for some people that's going to look really different for others. I think certainly parents of young kids, I think, will be potentially very glad to get back into the office, although it's been an interesting flip. I mean, I can speak personally. I've had an interesting pandemic experience. The same week we went on lockdown, I found out I was pregnant. So I had my entire pregnancy at home. And from that sense, it was actually great. I was able to take a rest when I needed to. And I was at the same time simultaneously able to work up until, I think, maybe 48 hours before I went into labor. So that was great. But, on the flip side, now I have a young baby, and I'm facing the flip side of that, living in a loft apartment with no walls and a young baby, and getting that work done is going to be very interesting. And so I think like everybody else, we're in a wait and see period, but I think we have ideas, and I think it's going to be a dialogue. First and foremost, it has to come from our conversations with, as Scott mentioned, our clients, but also our staff.
I mean, Marisa, I think your point's really, really important. And my partner, Jenna Knudsen, one of my partners, and I have been meeting with the parents group. We've met with them 3 or 4 times. And I think what we've come to realize, someone coined the term, there's a bit of a silent crisis going on with parents right now. They're suffering very badly. And, architects are naturally high performers. They're used to long hours. They want to achieve, they want to contribute, and they want to succeed. And people with young children are just not in a position to be able to do that at the same level. And so to some degree, what we've realized from these discussions is we as firm leaders have to give them permission to take the time that they need to take. And it has to come from us. We have to say it's okay. You're allowed to do that. The team leaders need to say, if you need that time off, you need to take that time off. You need to take care of whatever the issue is. Some of the parents are saying they don't even have time to make lunch for their kids. They're under so much stress. They have to take their laundry out because of the hours they're working on. So we're spending a lot of time trying to think about how to give them methods to lessen their load and to be able to communicate that to the team, and the team accepts that and understands that. And I think there's a lot of willingness to do that. We've entertained all sorts of different ideas as well, because frankly, if we don't address it as firm leaders, we run the risk that we're going to lose a lot of really talented people that will at some point throw their arms up and say, I can't take this anymore. It's just too hard on me and I'm going to make a hard choice. And we're going to lose a lot of really talented people. So I think for us, this is a really major issue going on within our practice, because we've got well over a dozen members with young families.
I think also, in addition to parents, I think that we see incredible loads on, on people taking care of their elderly parents, on people who are alone at home. I think that there are unique challenges for just about every demographic. And so, and I think there's also been, I think by now most people who are attending have experienced potentially some loss with related to the pandemic. And so so there's, there are all these unique circumstances that I think have really made it more challenging for almost everyone in very different ways,
Okay, I think maybe we can move on to questions then from the audience. And Jessica, did you want to?
Yeah, we actually have some great questions in here. I think that we kind of addressed the real challenges related to parents and caretaking of families as well. I think it's a great point that we're really all challenged right now, right? Pretty much everyone has something to take care of, but we hope that this is a temporary condition. So I think, hopefully things will continue to improve in that regard. I think there are two questions related to each other that are kind of speaking more to the long-term effects of our practice that I think are really interesting. So Will mentioned, how might competition change if we are sort of in this, lack of geographical tie to a physical practice. If we have to compete, as people in Southern California with firms across the country or across the world who can, pay for cheaper labor, how might that affect how we actually practice within our business? I think it's a great question just because we don't really know kind of how that might affect hiring practices, which is actually Marianne's question that follows. So if, the upside, right, is you can capitalize on talent in other locations. They might not have to get to an office location physically. But then the downside might be that you're actually competing with a broader range of geographical regions. So curious if you guys have thoughts on that.
I can chime in on something. I think that's a great question. I think it's one, the idea of sort of globalization and things is one that's been, I think, discussed even before, obviously, this pandemic. But I do think that the nature of what we do is it's place related, and there'll always be a certain component to it that is specific to place and to culture that I think often, and also, technical things like jurisdiction and all those things. But so I think at almost every location, it's important to have that connection, just because of what we do ultimately manifests in something physical located in a given place.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts from the group?
Yeah, I would offer, our office has hired a number of people in 2020. So that's presented a unique set of challenges, how you onboard someone remotely and how do you engage them into the culture of the practice and to the team. And so we've developed called a virtual buddy system for them to be able to have someone to work with to sort of learn the office and be a sounding board for ideas. I would say that we hired about 20 people in 2020, and probably half of them were actually remote. And we've said to them, stay remote. And at some point when we come together, you can come into Los Angeles. Now, having said that, I don't think that we have an expectation that they'll stay where they currently are. You know, to the point that Christina was raising, we still have a strong belief in our studio as being a locus of activity. And so we've said to them, we anticipate you will come to the office. Now, it may very well be in the future, we decide depending upon what they do and how they contribute, there may be wisdom in having them stay if it benefits them and it benefits the practice and our clients. And that's kind of the equation that we'll probably have to sort of weigh in on and understand.
This kind of ties into another set of questions we've got related to sort of tools and technologies. We have a few comments on Microsoft Teams, Google Meet, or maybe even using virtual reality or other kind of formats of tools. I think, Marisa, this actually gets back to a comment you made at the beginning about how, these kind of tools and infrastructure have already been in place for so long, and we're really now just kind of starting to take advantage of them. I'd be curious to hear about what you're using internally to coordinate with your teams, what tools or processes, and then also externally with your clients. Like I think you mentioned Mural, which is a great tool that we've been using for engagement with user groups and stakeholders and things like that. But yeah, any other thoughts you have that you might be willing to share about what's worked for you, in terms of internal and external collaboration?
I'm going to go on record and say I'm not the best tech person to answer that question. But we've been using a combination of Teams and Zoom, I think, for our internal communications, and then just getting on the old-fashioned telephone. But for our clients also, I think Zoom, Miro, I've worked with that. There was another panel, and I'm sorry, this was a few months ago, that it was a sort of Miro-like where you can do kind of collaborative interaction. And those programs have, I think, a lot of really interesting potential. Mm-hmm. I think that the technology, it will be really interesting to see what happens in terms of this technological sphere. And it seems like there's sort of like a wide open field to continue to innovate. And I'm sure that a lot of these groups and technology have already been thinking ahead to this sort of future component. And I think even as we are starting to design spaces that are workspaces, building in the infrastructure to support that kind of hybrid virtual / in-person collaboration, that'll be really interesting. And I think as I'm sort of thinking out loud here, I think it'll be interesting to see what kind of comes up to sort of balance that. I haven't seen anything that does that successfully. You either are sort of working in person on a whiteboard,
binary.
How can you go back and forth?
No, and I think that's a great comment too. There was another comment from Jennifer about, this is kind of an opportunity, to reevaluate things. She was talking specifically about work-life balance, which I think is really important. But I think even just, the modalities within which we work, right? We could all just go back to work and just kind of like, I think it was Christina or Aviva was saying, we're going back, right? Almost as if we're going back in time, but really this is an opportunity to look forward and reevaluate everything, how we work, who we're working with, the equitable balance of everything from work-life balance to kind of, who we hire, who we recruit. So I'm curious too if, looking forward, if any of these insights have kind of changed how you guys are thinking about growth or hiring practices, how strategically, we want to kind of continue into the future as firms. I'm gonna pick on Scott first.
Let's see. mean, I think there was a comment earlier in the chat about the possibility of working with people in different cities that have lower costs of living. Obviously, all of us know it's a challenge to bring in younger people into Los Angeles, a very expensive city to live in. The housing's expensive, the schools are expensive. So, you know, obviously there is an argument to be made that if you work more nationally, you can take advantage of people's ability to work in more reasonable cities with lower costs of living, and that would be an advantage. So it is, you know, we are currently talking to people in different parts of the country, and as I mentioned earlier, you know, we told them to stay. So it's a little bit open-ended right now as to what the future of that would be, but I think it has opened our eyes to the fact that probably some things that we sort of said that doesn't work for us, we're starting to take a step back and say, well, maybe it might work. We don't know exactly what that manifestation is, but we certainly have an openness and a willingness to it.
Yeah, I would say opening up the talent pool to more people is great for all of us to be able to really capitalize on, you know, different ideas from different places and how we can, you know, how that may affect our work environment here. But I think it also comes back to how you bring that person into the fold of the practice, like how to make sure that they feel like they're a part of something, and that you don't end up creating, you know, the people in the office have one experience and then the people working remotely have another experience. You know, you want it to be kind of a holistic experience that everybody is, you know, so that there aren't haves and have nots. So I think that that's still the challenge of having kind of the binary, some in the office and some remote, and that will just get exacerbated by if it's then another, you know, even further distance or a different time zone or however it is, that are you really starting to separate, you know, different groups of people in the office. So I think that's a challenge that we'll have to face.
Any other thoughts related to kind of future growth, future recruiting?
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
I was just asking if there were any other thoughts related to that topic.
Well, I think that it, you know, it's interesting. We certainly aren't looking to leverage, you know, folks in I think one of the questions was related to whether or not you leverage sort of the fact that you can work remotely and leverage your staff at like lower salaries who are living elsewhere. And I definitely, you know, we have a large practice. We definitely do not plan our work that way. You know, we see strong local presence as being relevant. I also think we have, and I know sometimes we feel powerless about this, but I think we have an impact as architects and urban planners to really bring to the forefront issues around, you know, affordability in our cities, right? And we are the people that can help to make a difference there. And so I'd hate to see us just sort of throw our hands up and say, you know, as a practice, we'll just, you know, oh, you know, LA is too expensive to live in, so we'll, you know, we'll hire folks that live in other places. I mean, that's our problem in our city, that we, you know, as local citizens need to help to address if it's important to our business. So I think that's where we can really help and advocate, you know, as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Aviva. You know, it's the idea of the citizen architect, right? You know, that we, you know, we are constituents of the built environment, you know, and we inhabit it, and we also design and build it too. So I think, you know, we sit at a unique intersection of expertise. And I think, you know, it gets back to kind of a lot of the same ideas that are happening in the chat conversation right now too, that, you know, there are benefits and, you know, drawbacks to hiring staff, you know, from other locales, or reducing commuting times, you know, like reducing our carbon footprints, things like that. You know, I think what I'm hearing from a lot of you is that a lot of this is going to come down to finding the right balance, right? So we want to see people in person, but we realize there are benefits to having more flexibility, being at home more often, seeing our families more, you know, spending less time in the car. But it's probably going to, you know, everyone kind of has to figure out what that right balance is, right? And it's probably going to be a little bit different for everybody, I think.
I mean, there's something of us, I guess we've been deliberating this because we're going to we're going to redo our office because our lease is coming up. But I mean, so imagine in a future scenario, a future place, and you're working in a composite way, and some people are virtual and some people are in person. So if the platform is a screen and a microphone and a speaker, what does that mean for the office, for the studio? Because it's in, we're all in our individual places, and we can talk and we can communicate and it works. But if we have a big open studio here and you can't have 6 or 7 people having simultaneous meetings going on. I mean, that's in and of itself a very specific challenge. Does that mean the office is going to go into a series of huddle rooms and people are going to be ducking in and out of these rooms? What does the studio become? And I don't know the answers. I'm not saying it therefore means you can't do it, but these are kind of issues we have to wrestle with as practitioners. Because we all, if someone's working quietly and trying to solve a problem and someone's on the phone with their headphones and their speaker, that's a whole other set of kind of issues to think about.
I have a feeling we're also going to learn a lot from working with our clients on these new evolving typologies. Certainly, work environments are going to change, and those of us who are in the sphere of designing them are going to have to keep up with the times. What is retail going to look like in the future? There are so many architectural implications for this remote world that we've all been existing in for about a year now. And there'll be a lot of lessons learned, some that I think will be really relevant to how we practice ourselves.
Absolutely. I've noticed there are a lot of great lists of kind of different tools in the chat. I encourage everyone to kind of check it out. It sounds like there's some really interesting ones that I haven't even heard of. One really interesting point, though, I think that's, the Brian, he mentioned a tool called TeamFlow, but ended with I think a really kind of critical point, which is that we're not really, built as humans to operate alone or in a vacuum for a long period of time. And I think I know I'm feeling that way. Absolutely. I'm actually going into the office for the first time in about 7 months this week to see 3 other people from a distance, so I'm curious, kind of leads me to the question of, are any of you kind of in the very near term thinking about going back, or, how are your plans going with vaccinations, as your staff kind of, go through that process, or how is, how are all of the developments that are currently going on affecting, your plans to get back into the office or gather as groups? How about Marisa? Do you mind?
I think that it's going to be a phased process. I know that our senior partner recently got vaccinated. I'm not entirely sure who else has been vaccinated, but I can take a guess. We don't ask people just too much, but it's going to be a phased process, and I think when we already have a group that meets weekly, related, we call it the Employee Success Group, and I think that that's going to be an ever-growing topic as we move forward. I confess I've also been on leave myself right now, so I won't be physically going back. So I'm not up to the moment on what that group has been discussing, but I will be in March, and I'll keep you posted.
So, in our office, I'm in the office tonight. So, and I come into the office 3 days a week, and we have maybe 10 to 15% of our people will come into the office on a rotating basis. And we have kind of a protocol for how to do that. And we bring in lunch every day so that we make it easy for people to come in the office, and they can work through their lunch hour, and we can just be one happy family. And that works pretty well. I think we are trying to be sensitive to everyone's kind of point of view about this. So I don't think right now, for the foreseeable future, we have any expectations or mandates in place that say by this date certain, we want this many people in. We tried that, kind of like Marisa said last year. We put all these plexiglass shields up in the office. We thought we're going to have this dialed in by Labor Day. We'll be back in the office, and that sort of blew up. So I think we've learned that we're just going to kind of take it 1 week at a time. To the extent that people feel comfortable, they can come in the office. We don't want to exceed a certain number of people in the studio, and we'll probably remain that way for the foreseeable future. And we do one of my partners, she spends quite a bit of time watching the protocols and the tiers and the expectations. Right now, we haven't had discussions about what is the requirement for reentry, a vaccine or something like that. I think that's really far out in the future for us.
Yeah, I would say that we at AIACOM are in a similar situation. Obviously we have a very large office, close to 300 people in downtown Los Angeles. So we've got a system in place for when people do want to come into the office, so that we don't ever exceed more than 50% capacity. Essentially just have a tracking system just to make sure. But typically there's about 1 or 2 people there. So not a problem yet. But okay, so last question. We're down to our last few minutes here. I know that we touched on mentorship earlier, and I definitely agree that I think mentorship is probably the area that has been most lacking, especially for junior staff. And so I think the question was, are there any programs or processes that any of you have been able to put in place where you've seen some success? And that could probably be defined however you see fit, but just staying connected or helping to make sure that younger staff are getting the information they need, or any kind of tools or methods you've used with them.
So in our office, we established, and this wasn't just for the more junior staff, but we decided to establish a check-in from the group of us in the leadership group. We were assigned a group of staff members, and we checked in with them once a week, and then this rotated. So each person on the staff would get kind of a one-on-one call to talk about, like, how are you doing and how is remote work going? And we got a lot of really interesting feedback that then that helped us then to sort of create additional support programs for the office. And now we actually do that in groups, and we don't do it individually, we do it in groups. But it's been a really great way also to connect with people that we might not have connected with even when we were in the office all together. We also have a one-on-one mentorship program. And while that sort of spontaneous mentorship hasn't, I think has suffered, the more structured program has actually continued, and it is working quite effectively.
That's really great to hear. Any others? Last thoughts?
I would say that our office, I think, needs to improve on the mentorship and in both structured and unstructured ways. That's something that we've been acutely discussing, I think, even before COVID, and now it's just all that more prescient. But one thing that I've personally enjoyed, I mentioned before, we have a weekly check-in, and I'm not sure whose idea it was. It was definitely not the leadership. It was one of our bright people from our design committee, but we have a segment of our weekly office check-in called 5 Seconds for Delight. Delight being a publication that Fred Fisher put together at this point, I think about 10 years ago, looking at just various sources of inspiration that bring you delight. And we've had different thematic topics every week, and people are bringing in such interesting sources of inspiration, whether it's from their daily lives or from their practice or from just out in the world sources of art and culture. And I think that's been a really great window into our own staff, and really kind of the most effective way we've been able to kind of keep cohesion during this time. And it's, it doesn't take a lot, but it's a lot of fun, and it's always inspiring, I would say.
Yeah, I would second what Marisa is saying, that I think what we've learned in the last 12 months is that we've learned to over communicate and to communicate as often as we can. We had sort of weekly meetings with all of the staff for a long period of time. We were constantly communicating about what was going on and what we were hearing and how we were doing financially from a marketing point of view, from a project point of view, because we sensed and we all felt, vulnerable. And so we wanted to make sure to sort of help people know where we were as much as we could. But I think what happened is that it changed kind of in the way that you said, Marisa, that it became ultimately more about various people telling stories and sharing impressions and ideas and things that they've learned and kind of moments of kind of pain and moments of brilliance. And so it actually drew our practice in some ways closer together than it's ever been. And so to the Aviva's point of the going forward, I think what we've learned in the going forward is we have to sort of grasp at those things that we've learned about how to communicate and engage everyone in a way that's different than perhaps was more sort of formally done in the practice before we went out. So a lot there for us to reflect on.
I think this is all really fantastic. I'm going to close things out for the evening and thank all of our panelists. I think you guys shared some really great insights. We really appreciate you being here and really appreciate the audience providing some great questions and commentary. Definitely encourage you all to read through it if you haven't had a chance yet. And I'm just going to turn it over to Lauren to close us out for the night, but thank you again, everybody.
Yes, I reiterate Jessica's thank you for being here, panelists. And I think we had really fantastic questions. We assembled this discussion because we know it's an ongoing dialogue and there'll be future panels probably talking about the same thing in a totally different way in the future. So we're hoping to continue the conversation. I think the biggest takeaways I took away today were, discussions of equity between the working styles, the need for flexibility in the future, how we can do the fluidity of design process and how that works. And I think the last thing being just engaging differently. And you had just said that, Scott, that we know it's going to be different and we may not know exactly what that is yet, but it will be different. So this session is actually recorded. Like we said, it's going to be on the YouTube channel for the AIALA. So feel free to, share this conversation, and I hope that we can continue the dialogue as we move forward. So thank you, panelists, and thank you, audience. Really appreciate everybody being here tonight. So thank you.